Hitler's personal assurance was also relayed via his deputy Martin Bormann to Franz Gertner, the Minister of Justice. In sum, Gerhardt's death was murder sanctioned by the state, which had now become the adjudicator not only of life and death, but also, apparently, in conferring absolution of guilt. At Nuremberg, Brandt testified that in Leipzig he discovered, and I quote, "a creature born blind, an idiot, at least it seemed to be an idiot, and it lacked one leg and part of an arm," unquote. The Leipzig physicians appeared to have offered little resistance, assuring Brandt that the Kretschmar child should die. Citing their professional experience on the maternity wards, they informed Brandt that it was, quote, "quite natural for doctors themselves to perform euthanasia in such a case without anything further being said about it," unquote. Shortly thereafter, a junior physician administered a lethal injection to Gerhardt while the nurses were taking a coffee break. Subsequent to the death of the Kretschmar child, Hitler authorized high-level officials to formally establish a state-sanctioned program to kill children suffering from physical and intellectual disabilities. So it was that the state moved from scattered murders upon request to an entire series of organizations to formally facilitate and expand the killing of people with disabilities. The Kretschmar child's death demonstrated that social and official precursors to widespread organized homicide of people with disabilities were firmly in place. In May 1939, Hitler ordered the creation of an advisory committee that would pave the way for the widespread killing of children with disabilities. The children's killing program was to report directly to Hitler's chancellery through a front organization under the pseudo-scientific but somewhat grand name of the Committee for the Scientific Treatment of Severe Genetically Determined Illnesses. I will come back to the word treatment in a minute. On August 18, 1939, prior to the German invasion of Poland, which began World War II, this committee produced a secret report which was disseminated to all state governments, requiring that all midwives and physicians who delivered infants with obvious congenital disabilities were to register these children and the nature of the disability, ostensibly, and again I quote, "to clarify certain scientific questions in areas of congenital deformity and mental retardation, such as idiocy or Mongolism, especially if associated with blindness or deafness, microcephaly or hydrocephaly of a severe or progressive nature, deformities of any kind, especially missing limbs, malformation of the head, or spina bifida, or crippling deformities such as spastics," unquote. The directive applied to children up to the age of 3. Across Germany, these new requirements were officially added to other information routinely required by the state at the birth of any child, such as evidence of venereal or other contagious diseases. As an incentive, midwives were paid for every infant with disability so registered. Failure to report these cases resulted in substantial fines. Later, this directive would also require teachers to report these disabilities among students in public schools. Information on the registered children was returned to the Reich Health Ministry in Berlin, where a panel of 3 medical experts sorted the children's records into 3 groups: those who would be allowed to live, those whose life or death decision was delayed, and those identified for the following euphemisms. Quote, treatment, disinfection, cleansing, therapy, all obviously euphemisms for extermination. Essentially, life and death decisions were now a chilling state administrative exercise. Those designated for extermination were transferred to one of 28 facilities, among them several of Germany's oldest and most respected research and teaching hospitals, where they were housed in specially designated killing wards. The Nazi authorities took great care to inform parents that their children would be housed in special wards at the clinics where they would, quote, provide all available therapeutic interventions made possible by recent scientific discoveries, unquote. However, here's a brief eyewitness account of the reality in the hospitals, and again I quote, I took a conducted tour of a madhouse. The doctor led us into a children's ward. The ward made a clean and cared-for impression. In about 15 beds, there were as many children, all aged between about 1 and 5. The doctor explained his intentions at some length. This is what the doctor said. As a National Socialist, these creatures, he meant the children with disabilities, naturally only present to me a burden upon the healthy body of our nation. We don't kill with poison injections, etc., since that would only give the foreign press and the Red Cross new hate propaganda material. No. As you see, our method is much simpler and more natural. With these words, and assisted by a nurse who worked in the ward, he pulled one of the children out of bed. He displayed the child around like a dead rabbit. The doctor pointed out with a knowing look and a cynical grin, "This one will last another 2 or 3 days." The image of this fat, grinning man with a whimpering skeleton in his fleshy hand, surrounded by other starving children, is still clear before my eyes, unquote. The methods of killings at institutions varied: starvation, exposure to cold by turning off all the heat in the ward, or for those uncooperative children who were resistant to other poisons, a fatal injection directly into the heart. The children's parents, of course, were deceived accordingly. As the child's condition deteriorated following the fatal dose, the parents would be informed that their child was seriously ill, and shortly thereafter that the child had died. Parents did not have time to arrange a visit to their sick child before the death notice arrived. The death notification, naturally, noted that the child had died of natural causes, suddenly and unexpectedly. By December 1940, it was officially permissible to kill children older than 3 years of age. And by late 1941, children and adolescents as old as 17 years old were also ensnared in this genocidal endeavor. As a logical extension of the children's killing program, adults with disabilities were next. In the summer of 1939, Hitler ordered implementation of a euthanasia program for adults with disabilities. The program was named Aktion T4, after the address of a front organization in Berlin at 4 Tiergartenstrasse. The stage was set. Adults with disabilities, conveniently housed in asylums and other institutions across Germany, were about to be murdered. After much discussion and experimentation, and sidebar, the experimentation included things like tying 30 or 40 people with disabilities together and blowing them up with dynamite, and deciding that was a far too messy way to go. After much discussion and experimentation, German officials decided that gas was the most effective means of committing mass murder, and set up gas chambers in 6 asylums across Germany. Inmates from other institutions were then transferred to the death asylums in gray buses, the buses' windows painted over so that the inmates could not look out, but more importantly, that the populace could not look in. At the killing centers, patients were weighed, photographed, and stamped if they were found to have some value after death, gold-filled teeth, for example. Most patients assumed that they were undergoing some kind of institutional exercise that they had endured many times before. After being told that they were entering an quote-unquote inhalation room for therapeutic reasons, an insulated door, complete with viewing window, slammed shut behind them. Gas was delivered here, as it would later be in the death camps, via a shower head in the ceiling. To complete the deception, policy dictated that only a physician was authorized to turn on the gas. The killing asylums provided a vast research reservoir of human material. In one instance, in order to study hereditary retardation, 56 inmates with mental retardation, epilepsy, and several displaying evidence of significant brain injury were delivered to research institutes where they were observed, examined, and killed. Their brains were quickly removed and studied by making comparisons between the autopsied brains and the data collected on the patients prior to their death. Little sidebar, some of those brains were still being used in German teaching hospitals into the 1980s. During the life of Octeon T4, the formal program, well over 80,000 adults with disabilities died. For decades, we have heard the plaintive cry, never again. However, Bosnia, Cambodia, Rwanda, and now Darfur teach us that there's a lot of tragic hollowness in many of our good intentions.